In 1533, a child was born into the turbulent court of Tudor England. Her name was Elizabeth, daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. From the very beginning, her life was marked by uncertainty. Her father, obsessed with producing a male heir, was deeply disappointed by her gender. He had risked everything, his marriage, his faith, his kingdom, to marry Anne. But instead of a prince, he got a girl. Soon, the tides turned even more harshly. When Elizabeth was barely 2 years old, her mother was executed on charges of adultery and treason, accusations that were, at best, politically motivated. Her father declared Elizabeth illegitimate, stripping her of her royal status. The once cherished daughter of a queen was now a political afterthought. But even then, fate had not finished playing its game. Elizabeth was sent away from court, raised in relative obscurity, yet surrounded by tutors and scholars. Despite being branded a bastard, she received an elite education, perhaps the best of any royal woman in Europe. By her teenage years, she could speak Latin, French, Italian, and Greek. She devoured philosophy, history, and theology. Elizabeth wasn't simply being prepared to survive, she was preparing herself to rule, though no one knew it yet. England at that time was fractured. King Henry's decisions had ripped the nation from the Catholic Church, plunging it into religious turmoil. When he died in 1547, the crown passed to his young son, Edward VI. Elizabeth's half-brother was a devout Protestant, and under his reign, England veered further away from Rome. Elizabeth, like a shadow on the wall, remained ever close to power, but never quite in it. Edward's reign was brief. After only 6 years, he died young, and the crown passed to Mary I, Elizabeth's older half-sister, a staunch Catholic. Her reign marked a terrifying chapter in English history. Determined to restore Catholicism, she launched a campaign of persecution. Protestants were burned alive, dissenters vanished. It was during this dark period that Elizabeth's life hung by a thread. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, suspected of conspiring against the Queen. For weeks, she awaited news of her fate, knowing that the same walls had once witnessed her mother's execution. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous. Lacking proof of her involvement, Mary eventually released her, but kept her under surveillance. Elizabeth returned to the countryside, watched and warned, but very much alive. When Mary died in 1558, without an heir, England turned its anxious eyes to Elizabeth. She was 25 years old, unmarried, Protestant, and brilliant. On November 17th, Elizabeth ascended the throne. The girl once labeled illegitimate had become the Queen of England. Her coronation marked more than a change of leadership. It marked a turning point in history. Elizabeth inherited a nation divided by decades of religious war, economic instability, and political unrest. But she met these challenges head-on. She declared herself the rightful monarch, ordained by God, and quickly took control of her court. She appointed capable advisors, notably William Cecil, who would remain her most trusted counselor for decades. One of her earliest and most contentious decisions was to re-establish the Church of England. This move alienated Catholic Europe, particularly the Pope and the King of Spain. But Elizabeth knew that wavering would only breed chaos. With a steady hand, she passed the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, declaring herself supreme governor of the Church and setting the religious tone of her reign. At home, Elizabeth's authority was challenged constantly, not just by rival nobles, but by Parliament itself. Chief among their concerns was her marital status. In a world where a queen's role was to marry and produce heirs, Elizabeth's refusal to wed was scandalous, yet she held firm. Marriage, she knew, was a trap. Any man she married would demand power. Instead, she offered herself to her people, famously stating, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely, the Kingdom of England." Her refusal to marry became a political strategy. Suitors came from across Europe, princes, dukes, even kings, but Elizabeth skillfully played them off one another, extracting political favors without ever accepting a ring. Her most well-known flirtation was Robert Dudley, the dashing Earl of Leicester. Whispers of romance followed them for years, but whether they were ever truly lovers remains a mystery. Elizabeth was always careful to preserve her image, powerful, pure, and untouchable. But her reign was not just defined by diplomacy and delay. It was also shaped by danger. Among the gravest threats was Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and the Catholic with a claim to the English throne. After a scandalous reign in Scotland, Mary fled to England, seeking refuge. Elizabeth allowed her to stay, but kept her under house arrest. For nearly 2 decades, Mary lived in a gilded prison, the focus of countless Catholic plots and foreign schemes. The most serious of these was the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. When proof of Mary's involvement was uncovered, Elizabeth faced an agonizing choice. She had long resisted calls to execute her cousin, fearing the political and moral consequences. But now, she had little choice. In 1587, Mary Stuart was executed. Elizabeth signed the warrant in sorrow, stating that she felt the weight of killing a sister queen. The execution of Mary further enraged Catholic Europe, especially Philip II of Spain. Already at odds with Elizabeth over religion, piracy, and power, Philip launched the Spanish Armada in 1588, a massive naval fleet intended to invade and conquer England. Faced with the gravest threat of her reign, Elizabeth rose to the moment. She rode out to address her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armor, and declared, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The words electrified her soldiers and became legend. When the Armada reached English shores, it was met with fierce resistance and bad weather. The mighty fleet was scattered and destroyed. It was a stunning victory and the high point of Elizabeth's rule.
The Golden Age of Elizabeth I. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was more than a military victory. It was a defining moment for England and a personal triumph for Elizabeth I. It solidified her reputation as a capable and courageous leader. It also marked the beginning of what would later be called the Elizabethan Golden Age. Following the Armada's destruction, national pride surged. England, once considered a second-rate power by its European neighbors, had humiliated mighty Spain. Elizabeth became a symbol of English resistance, Protestant identity, and sovereign pride. Paintings from this period, such as the famous Armada portrait, portrayed her as larger than life. Draped in pearls, her hand resting on a globe, eyes steady and commanding. She had become an icon. But victory did not mean peace. England remained surrounded by enemies and riven with internal conflict. Catholic plots still lingered. Ireland rebelled. And economic troubles, poor harvests, inflation, and unemployment threatened stability. Elizabeth, however, weathered each storm with her characteristic poise and political savvy. One of her most significant accomplishments was maintaining relative religious peace. After decades of bloody conflict, she enforced what was known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. It wasn't perfect. Both radical Protestants and devoted Catholics were displeased, but it provided a framework for tolerance, at least by the standards of the 16th century. While the Queen sought religious moderation, she also ruled with firm control. dissent was not tolerated. Her intelligence network, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, rooted out traitors with ruthless efficiency. Her courts prosecuted sedition. Elizabeth understood the power of information and fear. She used them both to maintain her grip on the crown. Yet her rule was not only one of authority and conflict. It was also a cultural renaissance. Under Elizabeth, England bloomed artistically and intellectually. Theaters flourished, literature blossomed. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, all these literary giants produced their greatest works during her reign. The Queen herself loved the arts. She supported music, poetry, and drama. She often attended performances at court and even had private plays commissioned. She saw the arts not only as entertainment, but as tools of statecraft, ways to shape public opinion and glorify the image of her rule. Trade and exploration also expanded under Elizabeth's guidance. With the seas opened to English ships, bold adventurers set out to chart new territories and claim riches abroad. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to colonize the Americas, founding the ill-fated Roanoke colony. While many of these ventures were driven by ambition and greed, they also laid the groundwork for what would become the British Empire. Elizabeth encouraged these efforts, though cautiously. She preferred to support privateers, essentially government-sanctioned pirates, who raided Spanish ships and brought home gold. It was a risky but profitable enterprise that added to her treasury and weakened her rivals. Throughout all this, Elizabeth continued to rule alone. Her status as the Virgin Queen had become part of her mystique. While other monarchs were remembered for their marriages or dynasties, Elizabeth was remembered for her independence. She crafted a persona of nearly divine strength, a monarch above personal desire. This image was carefully cultivated. She wore elaborate gowns and jewelry, painted her face with white lead, and even appeared in public like a living statue of power. She became almost mythical, a symbol rather than a person. But the woman behind the crown was not without pain. She lost many close companions over the years. The death of Robert Dudley in 1588, just after the Armada victory, deeply affected her. She kept a letter he had written to her shortly before his death in a locked box beside her bed for the rest of her life. She also suffered from the loneliness of her position. Though constantly surrounded by courtiers and flatterers, few could truly speak to her as an equal. She had sacrificed family, love, and normalcy for the sake of the throne. Her life was entirely consumed by duty. As the 1590s progressed, the challenges of rule began to take a toll. England faced new difficulties: recession, famine, and war in Ireland. Her advisors aged and died one by one, including William Cecil. His son, Robert Cecil, succeeded him, but it was not the same. The glow of the early Elizabethan era began to fade. Younger courtiers, like the ambitious and flamboyant Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, sought to gain influence at court. Essex was once a favorite of the Queen, but he grew reckless and arrogant. In 1601, after a failed rebellion against her authority, he was arrested and executed. Elizabeth was devastated. It was the last time she would ever allow herself to be close to anyone. Though political mind remained sharp, her health began to decline. She lost weight, became increasingly melancholy, and withdrew from court life. Her once fiery speeches became rare. Her final years were spent mostly in silence and solitude. Yet despite her sorrow and age, the Queen never relinquished control. She ruled until the very end. No regency, no co-ruler, no abdication. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth fell gravely ill. She refused to go to bed, standing for hours, unwilling to lie down, fearing that if she did, she would never rise again. She spoke little, nodded rarely, but when asked who should succeed her, she reportedly murmured, "My cousin of Scotland, James VI, son of Mary Stuart, the very woman she had executed." On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at the age of 69. She had ruled for 44 years.
When Elizabeth I died in 1603, all of England held its breath. It was the end of an era, the end of the Tudor dynasty, and the passing of a queen who had ruled alone, without husband or child, for nearly half a century. Her death marked more than just a change in monarchs. It marked the closing chapter of a time when England transformed from a troubled, fractured kingdom into a rising world power. News of her death spread slowly. Across the kingdom, churches tolled their bells. Nobles and commoners alike mourned, unsure of what the future might hold. But even in death, Elizabeth managed what she had mastered in life: control. She had chosen her successor, James VI of Scotland, with care. By naming him, she ensured a peaceful transfer of power. No civil war, no rebellion. Her wisdom endured beyond the grave. What she left behind was a country stronger, more confident, and more united than it had been in generations. Elizabeth's reign had been a balancing act, a tightrope walk between religious factions, foreign threats, and internal unrest. And yet, through sheer will, cunning diplomacy, and charismatic leadership, she had succeeded where many others would have failed. Her legacy was not just in politics or foreign policy, it was in identity. Under her rule, the English began to think of themselves as a distinct people with a distinct destiny. She had given them pride. She had given them purpose. She had given them victory. But how did she do it? Part of her strength lay in her intelligence. Elizabeth was no puppet queen. She read extensively, consulted widely, and made decisions carefully. She understood her people, and perhaps more importantly, she understood power. She knew when to act and when not to. Her ability to delay decisions until the perfect moment was legendary. She did not rush, she calculated. Another part of her strength was performance. Elizabeth turned her entire life into a stage play, one in which she was both actress and director. She used symbolism and image as weapons. Her portraits were filled with coded messages: pearls for chastity, globes for dominion, serpents for wisdom. Her public appearances were choreographed with precision. She became a myth in her own lifetime. Then there was her voice. Elizabeth's speeches were stirring, eloquent, and fearless. Whether addressing Parliament or her troops, she spoke with clarity and conviction. One of her most famous addresses to the soldiers at Tilbury remains etched in English memory. "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She didn't just say the words, she meant them, and everyone knew it. Critics might argue that she was lucky, that the winds that scattered the Spanish Armada were heaven sent, or that her success was built on the work of advisors like William Cecil. And yes, she relied on others. But that was part of her genius. She chose good people. She listened to them. Then she made up her own mind. That's not luck. That's leadership. What made Elizabeth a true badass queen wasn't just her defiance or her independence. It was her complexity. She was both tough and vulnerable, both gracious and unforgiving. She could be charming or chilling, generous or ruthless. She had the spine of a warrior and the mind of a philosopher. She refused to be defined by any single role. She was not just a daughter or a sister or a monarch. She was the state itself. As one of her advisors once said, she is all the men in her council.
That is, she had the mind and capacity of an entire cabinet within her single frame. She outlived all her enemies, all her suitors, and many of her closest allies. She survived plots, invasions, and scandals. And when she died, her people wept, not just because their queen was gone, but because the symbol of their strength had passed with her. Her legacy would inspire generations. The Victorians would idolize her. The suffragettes would invoke her name. Historians would debate her choices, her policies, even her personality. But no one would forget her. And beyond England, her legacy rippled outward. She laid the foundations for the British Empire, encouraged exploration that reshaped the world, and helped anchor Protestantism as a political and religious force. Her reign stabilized a kingdom that could have easily collapsed. Above all, Elizabeth I proved something extraordinary, that a woman, ruling alone in an age of men, could not only survive, but triumph. She shattered expectations. She redefined monarchy. She showed that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is not the loudest, but the one that speaks last. Even today, more than 4 centuries after her death, Elizabeth's shadow stretches long across history. She has become a symbol of intelligence, resilience, and unmatched power. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real, a woman who bore the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders and never let it crush her. She was not born to rule. She was not meant to survive. But she did both. And that, more than crowns or castles or battles, is what makes her a true legend.
In the final years of her life, Elizabeth I was not the dazzling figure that had once captivated Europe. Her beauty had faded. The fiery red hair was now hidden beneath towering wigs. The luminous white skin was maintained only by layers of poisonous makeup, lead and vinegar, applied religiously each day. Behind the mask, she was tired. Behind the eyes, she carried the weight of an empire and 1,000 memories. She had ruled for so long, longer than many of her subjects had been alive, that the idea of England without Elizabeth was unimaginable. But time, as always, was unrelenting. Her old allies and confidants were gone. Her inner circle had changed. Even the nation she ruled was not the same one she had inherited. It was now stronger, prouder, and more self-assured. But its queen was growing weary. In the winter of 1602, her health began to decline. She suffered from insomnia, depression, and a series of minor illnesses. But more than her body, it was her spirit that began to dim. The death of her last true friend, Catherine Carey, left her despondent. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. She spent hours standing silently, refusing to lie down, terrified, perhaps, that if she did, she would never rise again. For weeks, she lingered in this twilight state. And then, on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, took her final breath at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. The woman who had once stood before armies, outwitted kings and silenced parliaments, was gone. But her absence felt anything but silent. It echoed across the land, across the Channel, across time itself. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With no children, no direct heirs, the crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. Thus began the Stuart era and a new chapter for the British Isles. Yet no successor, no matter how wise or powerful, could truly fill her shoes. Her funeral was grand but heavy with grief.
As her coffin was carried through the streets of London, people lined the roads in silence, many weeping openly. For many, this was not the burial of a monarch. It was the burial of an age. And what an age it had been. Under Elizabeth, England had become a beacon of culture and progress. The Elizabethan era had seen the rise of Shakespeare and the English language elevated to poetic glory. It had witnessed the birth of modern naval power, the beginnings of empire, and the forging of a national identity. She left no heir, but she left a nation. And in the centuries that followed, her legend only grew. Historians wrote of her triumphs and her tragedies. Artists painted her again and again, immortalizing her in pearl and gold. Writers romanticized her reign. Filmmakers dramatized her life. Schoolchildren recited her speeches. Her name became more than just history, it became mythology. But strip away the myths, and what remains is still astonishing. A girl born under suspicion, declared illegitimate, mother executed, imprisoned, threatened, surrounded by enemies. And yet, she rose. She took a kingdom broken by blood and faith and turned it into a power that dared to challenge the world. She fought not with armies, but with vision, not with heirs, but with ideas. She ruled with elegance and steel, often simultaneously. She lived in a world that told women to be silent, obedient, secondary. She answered with command, eloquence, and singular will. She was not defined by a husband. She was not remembered as a mother. She became something more, a monarch forged by hardship, refined by intelligence, and sustained by sheer determination. She knew loneliness, she knew fear, but she also knew greatness, and she embraced it. Her favorite motto was Semper Idem, always the same. And perhaps she was always strong, always brilliant, always the Queen. Elizabeth I was, in every sense, a woman out of her time, a figure more modern than many who came after her. She didn't just change her country, she changed what was possible for women, for leadership, and for the future itself. Even now, centuries later, her words still resonate, her image still commands, and her story, her fierce, fearless, extraordinary story, remains one of the most compelling ever told. She was not supposed to rule. She was not supposed to survive. But she did both, magnificently. And that is why Elizabeth I wasn't just a queen.